On December 25, 1991, at precisely 7:32 p.m. Moscow time, the red flag of the Soviet Union was lowered from the Kremlin dome for the last time. Television cameras from around the world captured the moment as the hammer and sickle disappeared into the winter darkness, replaced moments later by the tricolor flag of the Russian Federation. To most observers watching that historic evening, what they witnessed appeared to be a political collapse, perhaps the final victory of democracy over totalitarianism, or the defeat of communist ideology by Western liberalism. Newspaper headlines the next morning would declare the end of the Cold War, the triumph of freedom, and the vindication of capitalism. But if you had walked into the offices of the Ministry of Finance in Moscow that night and opened the ledger books, you would have seen a very different story. The columns of numbers told a tale not of ideology or revolution, but of accounting. The Soviet Union didn't collapse because communism was morally inferior or because its people yearned for democracy. It collapsed because it had run out of money. The treasury was empty. The gold vaults were bare. The credit was exhausted. What the world witnessed on December 25, 1991 was not a political revolution. It was the greatest bankruptcy in human history. This is the story of how a superpower that possessed more than 40,000 nuclear warheads, an army of 5 million men, and territory spanning 11 time zones, found itself unable to afford bread for its citizens. It is the story of a nation that became addicted to a single resource, and what happened when the price of that resource collapsed. It is a lesson in economics, dependency, and the dangerous illusion that natural resources equal national wealth. To understand how a superpower goes bankrupt, we must travel back to the moment when Soviet leaders believed they had discovered infinite riches. Act I. The discovery, black gold in the frozen north. The year was 1965. In the desolate, frozen wastelands of western Siberia, far beyond the Ural Mountains, Soviet geologists made a discovery that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the 20th century. After years of exploratory drilling in temperatures that regularly dropped below -40 degrees, they struck oil. Not just a modest field, but the Samatler deposit, a vast underground ocean of crude petroleum that would become one of the largest oil fields ever discovered on Earth. At its peak, Samatler alone would produce more than 3 million barrels of oil per day. To the leadership in the Kremlin, this discovery seemed like a miracle sent by history itself. The Soviet economy in the mid-1960s was already showing signs of stagnation. The initial burst of industrialization under Stalin had faded. The command economy was struggling to produce consumer goods that anyone actually wanted to buy. Soviet cars broke down constantly. Soviet televisions were fire hazards. Soviet washing machines were jokes. The technological gap with the West was widening with each passing year, but suddenly none of that seemed to matter. The Soviet Union didn't need to manufacture competitive products or innovate in consumer goods. They didn't need to reform their inefficient factories or modernize their agricultural system. They just needed to drill holes in the frozen ground and pump out oil. The black gold would pay for everything. Throughout the 1970s, as massive pipelines stretched across the Siberian tundra toward Europe, the Soviet Union transformed itself into a petrostate. The 1973 OPEC oil embargo against the West sent global petroleum prices skyrocketing from roughly $3 per barrel to over $12 per barrel almost overnight. By 1980, oil prices had climbed above $35 per barrel. For the Soviet Union, which was rapidly becoming the world's largest oil producer, this price surge represented the greatest financial windfall in Russian history. Between 1973 and 1980, hard currency revenues from oil and gas exports flooded into Moscow, more than $200 billion in total. The leadership celebrated. Ministers gave speeches about the new Soviet prosperity. They built grand projects and funded ambitious programs. But this wealth was not a blessing. It was a curse in disguise, and it would prove fatal. The easy money from oil exports masked the deep structural rot in the Soviet economy. Because the petrodollars flowed so effortlessly, Soviet leaders stopped trying to fix the fundamental problems. Why invest in agricultural reform when you can sell oil and import grain? Why modernize manufacturing when you can export crude and import machinery? Why encourage innovation when commodity extraction requires none? The Soviet Union became what economists would later call a petrostate, essentially a third world resource economy with first world nuclear missiles. By the early 1980s, approximately 60% of Soviet hard currency earnings came from energy exports. They were no longer making things the world wanted to buy. They were exporting raw materials and importing nearly everything else: food, consumer goods, industrial equipment, even basic manufacturing components. The Soviet Union was trading the blood of the earth for the products of human ingenuity, and the trade was fundamentally unsustainable. Act II. The illusion of stability. Building on sand, the oil wealth enabled the Soviet leadership to buy something they desperately needed: social peace. With the hard currency flowing in, they could subsidize virtually everything. Bread was kept artificially cheap, sometimes costing less than the grain used to make it. Housing was subsidized to the point of being nearly free. Public transportation cost a few kopecks. Utilities were negligible. The Soviet social contract was simple. The people would tolerate the lack of political freedom, the gray conformity, the surveillance, and the propaganda in exchange for economic stability and basic security. The oil money also funded the Soviet Empire beyond Russia's borders. Throughout Eastern Europe, from East Germany to Bulgaria, the Soviets propped up satellite regimes with subsidized oil and gas, selling energy to their allies at prices far below the world market rate. Cuba received billions in aid. Vietnam was supported. Angola, Ethiopia, and other client states across Africa and Asia were bankrolled. All of this was affordable as long as oil prices remained high. Meanwhile, the military consumed an enormous portion of the economy. Western estimates placed Soviet military spending at between 15% and 20% of GDP, compared to roughly 5% to 7% in the United States. The Soviet Union was trying to maintain nuclear parity with America, fund a massive conventional army, support a blue water navy, and compete in the space race, all simultaneously. The costs were staggering, but the oil revenues seemed capable of covering them. From the outside, the Soviet Union in the late 1970s appeared formidable. It was a superpower with global reach, feared by its adversaries and respected by its allies. But beneath the surface, a dangerous dependency had formed. The entire stability of the Soviet system, its social programs, its empire, its military might, was pegged to a single variable: the international price of crude oil. As long as oil traded above $30 per barrel, the system could function. The moment that price fell, the whole structure would be at risk. And in the early 1980s, that price began to wobble. Act III. The hidden catastrophe. Soviet agriculture collapses. There was another crisis brewing, one that receives less attention in the standard narratives of the Cold War, but was equally important to the Soviet collapse: the total failure of Soviet agriculture. The Soviet Union possessed some of the richest farmland on Earth. The black soil regions of Ukraine and southern Russia were naturally fertile and had fed empires for centuries. Yet by the 1970s, the Soviet Union could not feed itself. The collective farm system, imposed by Stalin and never seriously reformed, was a disaster of epic proportions. Central planners in Moscow would set quotas for production without any understanding of local conditions. Farmers had no incentive to work efficiently because they didn't own the land or the harvest. Machinery was outdated and constantly breaking down. Storage facilities were inadequate. Transportation infrastructure was poor. The result was catastrophic waste, Estimates suggest that up to 30% of harvested grain rotted in the fields or in storage before it ever reached consumers. Potatoes would freeze in unheated warehouses. Vegetables would spoil in transit. The gap between what Soviet farms produced and what Soviet citizens needed grew wider each year. By the late 1970s, the Soviet Union was importing between 30 and 40 million tons of grain annually. And where was this grain coming from? Primarily from the United States, Canada, Australia, and Argentina, in other words, from the capitalist West. The irony was bitter. The superpower that had defeated Nazi Germany, that had collectivized agriculture in the name of communist efficiency, now depended on its ideological enemy to feed its people. By the early 1980s, the Soviet Union was spending roughly half of its hard currency earnings, billions of dollars, just to import grain. They were selling oil to buy wheat. It was a humiliating cycle of dependency, but Moscow had no choice. Without the grain imports, there would be famine. The leadership looked at their revenue streams and calculated that the oil money would cover the grain purchases indefinitely. They assumed the good times would last forever. They were catastrophically wrong. Act IV, the perfect storm, when the price collapsed. The year 1985 marked a turning point. In March, a relatively young and energetic Communist Party official named Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Soviet Union. At 54, he was a generation younger than the elderly, dying leaders who had preceded him. Gorbachev recognized that the Soviet system was stagnating. He knew that innovation had ground to a halt, that corruption was endemic, that the people were cynical and demoralized. But he believed the problems were fixable through reform, through perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost openness. Gorbachev announced ambitious plans to modernize Soviet industry, to invest in new technologies, to make Soviet products competitive in world markets. To fund this massive restructuring, he would need substantial capital. He looked at the budget projections and assumed the oil revenues would be there to pay for it all. His economic advisors had calculated everything based on oil prices remaining around $30 per barrel or higher. Then the floor dropped out. On September 13, 1985, the Saudi Arabian oil minister, Sheikh Ahmed Zaki Yamani, made an announcement that would change history. Saudi Arabia, frustrated that it had been limiting its own production to prop up prices while other producers cheated and pumped at full capacity, declared that it would open the taps and flood the market. The Saudis would reclaim market share even if it meant crashing the price. The result was carnage in global oil markets. The price of crude, which had been trading at around $30 per barrel in 1985, collapsed to below $10 per barrel by July 1986, a drop of more than two-thirds in less than a year. For the Soviet Union, this price crash was an economic catastrophe of unprecedented scale. Virtually overnight, they lost more than half their export income. Tens of billions of dollars in expected revenue simply evaporated. To understand the impact, imagine if you suddenly lost half your salary, but your mortgage payment, your car loan, your credit card bills, and your grocery costs all stayed exactly the same. That was the situation facing the Soviet government. The entire budget had been calculated based on high oil prices. Suddenly, there was a massive hole in the ledger, and the shortfall had to be made up somewhere. This catastrophe struck at the worst possible moment. The Soviet Union was bogged down in Afghanistan, where it had invaded in 1979 to prop up a failing communist regime. The war was costing billions of dollars annually and producing nothing but casualties and demoralization. The Soviets were simultaneously trying to maintain military parity with the United States, which under President Reagan was embarking on a massive defense buildup, including the Strategic Defense Initiative, the Star Wars program. Matching American military spending required enormous resources. On top of everything else, the grain had to be purchased. Ships full of American and Canadian wheat were arriving at Soviet ports every week, and the suppliers demanded payment in hard currency, in dollars or gold. They would not accept rubles because the ruble was a soft currency, worthless outside the Soviet Union. You couldn't use rubles to buy wheat or machinery or spare parts on international markets. You needed real money. Act V. The debt trap, borrowing to survive. Faced with collapsing revenues and fixed expenses, Gorbachev confronted an impossible choice. He could slash military spending, which would enrage the generals and the defense establishment. He could cut the subsidies on food and housing, which would trigger social unrest. Or he could borrow. He chose to borrow. Beginning in the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union took out massive loans from Western banks, German, French, British, and Japanese financial institutions. The bankers were initially happy to lend. After all, this was a superpower with a seemingly stable government, vast natural resources, and substantial gold reserves. A superpower doesn't go bankrupt, right? The Soviet Union had never defaulted on its external debts. It seemed like a safe investment. So the loans flowed in, billions upon billions of dollars. But this wasn't productive investment capital being used to build new industries or develop infrastructure that would generate future returns. This was survival money. The Soviet government was borrowing just to pay for imported food and consumer goods, just to keep the store shelves from looking completely bare. They were borrowing to cover the budget deficit, to pay wages, to maintain the subsidies. It was the classic debt spiral, borrowing not to invest and grow, but merely to consume and survive. The debt accumulated rapidly. In 1985, Soviet foreign debt stood at roughly $20 billion. By 1989, it had exploded to more than $50 billion, and the trajectory was accelerating. To make matters worse, Gorbachev made a well-intentioned but economically disastrous domestic policy mistake: the anti-alcohol campaign. He recognized that alcoholism was destroying Soviet society, devastating public health, lowering productivity, and tearing families apart. In 1985, he launched a campaign to reduce alcohol consumption, restricting sales of vodka and other spirits, destroying vineyards and raising prices. Morally, the campaign made sense. Economically, it was suicide. The tax on alcohol sales was one of the largest sources of government revenue, second only to oil. By restricting vodka sales, Gorbachev eliminated billions of rubles in annual tax income. And the people didn't stop drinking. They simply switched to homemade alcohol, brewing samagon moonshine in their kitchens and bathtubs. So the state received zero revenue, while sugar disappeared from store shelves because people were buying it in bulk to ferment at home. By 1988, the Soviet budget deficit was spiraling out of control. Government revenues had collapsed due to low oil prices and the alcohol restrictions, while expenditures remained enormous. Desperate for cash, the government began doing the one thing that every economics textbook warns against. They started printing money. The central bank ran the presses day and night, creating rubles to pay wages and pensions and subsidies. But this created a new problem. There was now an enormous amount of money circulating in the economy, but there were no goods to buy. The factories weren't producing enough consumer goods, and imports were being restricted to conserve hard currency. This created what economists call a monetary overhang. People had cash in their pockets, but store shelves were empty. Savings accounts grew because there was nothing to spend money on. The shortage economy intensified. People would stand in line for 4 hours just to buy a loaf of bread. If you saw a queue forming on a street, you would join it without even asking what was being sold. It might be shoes, it might be sausages, it might be soap. You grabbed whatever you could because tomorrow it might be gone. Rationing returned. Ration coupons for basic goods, something not seen since World War II, reappeared in Soviet cities. The social contract was breaking down. The Soviet people had tolerated decades of political repression and drab conformity because the state had delivered on its basic promise: stability, security, and a minimal standard of living. Now that promise was collapsing. The stores were empty. The money was losing value. The system that had guaranteed basic security was failing. Act VI. The Empire Crumbles, 1989, and the loss of Eastern Europe as economic crisis deepened inside the Soviet Union. The external empire began to unravel. In 1989, a wave of revolution swept across Eastern Europe. The Berlin Wall fell on November 9th. Communist regimes in Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria toppled in rapid succession. To most observers in the West, this looked like a political liberation, the triumph of democracy and freedom over oppression. But to the accountants and economists in Moscow, the loss of Eastern Europe was a financial catastrophe. For decades, the Soviet Union had sustained its satellite states through subsidized trade. Soviet oil and gas flowed to Eastern Europe at prices far below the world market rate. Essentially, a hidden subsidy worth billions of dollars annually. Meanwhile, the satellites provided manufactured goods, often of poor quality, which the Soviets bought at inflated prices. When the communist governments fell and the new democratic regimes began to assert independence, this entire trading system collapsed. The new governments of Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia announced they would no longer trade on preferential terms. They demanded payment in hard currency, in dollars, for their exports, and they wanted to buy oil and gas at market prices or from Western sources. The closed economic loop that had sustained the Soviet Empire for 40 years disintegrated almost overnight. The loss of these captive markets and the end of subsidized trade represented yet another blow to Soviet finances. The Kremlin could no longer count on Eastern Europe to absorb Soviet exports or to provide goods in return for cheap energy. The empire had become a net drain, and now it was gone. Act VII. The final collapse. Running out of everything by 1990, the Soviet economy wasn't merely stagnating. It was actively disintegrating. The gold reserves, once a source of national pride, were vanishing at an alarming rate. In the mid-1980s, Soviet vaults held an estimated 2,000 to 25,000 tons of gold. Throughout the late 1980s, the government had been secretly selling gold in London and Zurich markets to raise hard currency for grain purchases and debt payments. They sold so much gold so quickly that they depressed the global gold price, receiving less value for each sale. By 1991, investigations would reveal that only about 240 tons of gold remained, roughly one-tenth of what had existed just a few years earlier. The rest had been sold, smuggled, or simply vanished amid the chaos and corruption of the collapsing state. Then came the War of Laws, the final internal blow that shattered the Soviet budget. As Gorbachev's reforms unleashed political openness, the constituent republics of the USSR began to assert sovereignty. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, declared independence. Ukraine announced sovereignty. And most devastating of all, the Russian Republic, led by Boris Yeltsin, began to defy the Central Soviet government. Yeltsin, in a calculated move to undermine Gorbachev, instructed tax collectors in Russia to stop sending revenue to the Central Soviet budget. Keep the money here in Russia, he told them. Don't remit it to Moscow. Other republics followed suit. The result was catastrophic for Gorbachev. The central government's revenue streams dried up almost completely. He was president of a superpower, commander of the world's largest military arsenal, but he had no income. In 1990 and 1991, the unthinkable began to happen. The Soviet Union started defaulting on commercial obligations. Ships carrying imported meat, butter, and other food would anchor off Soviet ports but refuse to unload their cargo because the payments weren't coming through. Ship captains would radio back to their companies, "The checks are bouncing." Western suppliers began demanding payment in advance or refusing to ship at all. The Soviet government was forced to beg. Officials traveled to Western capitals, literally asking for humanitarian aid, for grants and loans to buy food. It was a profound humiliation. The nation that had defeated Hitler's Germany, that had put the first human in space, was now asking for charity to feed its people. The Bank, the Soviet institution responsible for managing foreign economic transactions, froze all accounts. Soviet state enterprises that had earned hard currency through exports suddenly found their accounts empty. The state had confiscated the funds to pay the national debt. It was outright theft, but it was also a sign of absolute desperation. The ruble ceased to function as real money. The economy reverted to barter. Factories would pay their workers in whatever products they manufactured: tires, televisions, crystal glassware, and workers would then stand by the roadside trying to trade their goods for food. The black market became the only functional market. The US dollar became the real currency. Taxi drivers, hotel staff, and anyone with access to foreign tourists became the new elite because they could earn dollars. Meanwhile, professors, scientists, and engineers, the educated middle class, were reduced to poverty. Act VIII, August coup and final dissolution in August 1991, a group of hardline communists, senior officials terrified by the pace of change, attempted a coup against Gorbachev. They detained him at his vacation home in Crimea and sent tanks into Moscow. They declared a state of emergency and promised to restore order and reverse the reforms. The coup collapsed within 3 days. Boris Yeltsin, standing on a tank outside the Russian parliament building, rallied opposition. The military refused to fire on civilians. The plotters, realizing they had failed, scattered. But the coup's failure demonstrated one crucial fact. Even if the hardliners had succeeded in seizing power, they had no solution to the fundamental problem. They had no plan to fix the empty treasury, no plan to pay the debts, no plan to put food on the shelves. You cannot shoot economics. The empire was bankrupt, and no amount of military force could change that reality. When Gorbachev returned to Moscow after the failed coup, he was a spent force. Real power had shifted to Boris Yeltsin and the leaders of the individual republics. But the crushing weight of debt remained. By late 1991, Soviet foreign debt had reached approximately $70 billion, and there was no capacity to service it. Western banks and the G7 governments were alarmed. If the Soviet Union disintegrated, who would be responsible for repaying the loans? The creditors demanded a joint and several liability agreement from the emerging independent states. They told the former Soviet republics, "We don't care who's in charge or what your internal arrangements are. Someone must guarantee this debt." After intense negotiations, Russia agreed to assume 100% of the Soviet Union's foreign debt in exchange for claiming all Soviet foreign assets: the embassies, the foreign bank accounts, the remaining gold, the property abroad. In the final months of 1991, the Soviet Union existed only on paper. There was no money to pay the November payroll. There was no money for December salaries. The printing presses ran around the clock, churning out high-denomination banknotes that lost value almost as soon as they were printed. Hyperinflation was taking hold. On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev sat at his desk in the Kremlin to sign his resignation as president of the Soviet Union. He didn't resign because an enemy army had conquered Moscow. He didn't resign because of a successful revolution or a military defeat. He resigned because the state he led was insolvent. It could no longer pay its bills, feed its people, or function as a government. That evening, as the red flag was lowered from the Kremlin, what ended was not just a political system, but an economic entity that had run out of money. Epilogue. The aftermath and the lesson: the Soviet Union officially ceased to exist at midnight on December 25, 1991, but its financial ghost haunted the successor states for decades. The Russian Federation, as the primary heir, inherited not only the nuclear weapons and the UN Security Council seat, but also the crushing burden of Soviet-era debt. Throughout the 1990s, Russia struggled under the weight of these obligations. The interest payments alone consumed enormous portions of the federal budget, limiting the government's ability to ease the transition to a market economy. The economic shock therapy that followed, the rapid privatization, the lifting of price controls, the opening to foreign trade, was shaped by this debt burden. There was simply no money to cushion the blow. Subsidies were eliminated overnight. Prices for bread, milk, and other staples increased by 2,000% or more in a matter of weeks. The life savings of millions of ordinary Russians, held in state savings accounts, were wiped out by hyperinflation. Poverty rates soared. Life expectancy actually declined. In 1998, Russia defaulted again, this time on its domestic debt, triggering a global financial crisis and the collapse of the long-term capital management hedge fund in the United States. It wasn't until the early 2000s, when global oil prices began rising again, that Russia finally regained its financial footing. In 2006, 15 years after the Soviet collapse, Russia made its final payment on Soviet-era debt to Bosnia and Herzegovina. The books were finally closed. It had taken a quarter century to escape the financial shadow of the Soviet Union. The lesson, the resource curse and the illusion of wealth, the fall of the Soviet Union, stands as the ultimate cautionary tale of what economists call the resource curse, or Dutch disease. It teaches a fundamental lesson. Natural resources are not the same as economic strength. The Soviet leadership confused luck with capability. They found oil beneath the tundra and mistook geology for genius. They used the windfall from high commodity prices to mask deep structural failures in their economy. A truly wealthy nation is one that builds things, innovates, educates its people, and creates value through productivity and ingenuity. The Soviet Union stopped doing these things. They drilled holes in the ground and sold the contents. When the price of that commodity collapsed, the illusion of wealth evaporated. The Soviets pegged their entire system to a number on a trading screen in Rotterdam or New York, the spot price of crude oil. When that number fell below a certain threshold, the empire became unsustainable. Nuclear weapons couldn't change that calculus. The KGB couldn't arrest it. Communist ideology couldn't explain it away. An empire that cannot afford to buy bread for its citizens is not an empire at all. It is a financial time bomb waiting to explode. In the end, the Cold War was not decided primarily by missiles or spies or ideology. It was decided by ledgers and grain shipments and oil prices and interest rates. The Soviet Union didn't fall to an invading army. It went bankrupt. The hammer and sickle came down not because they were defeated on the battlefield, but because the treasury was empty and the creditors were calling. This is the greatest bankruptcy in human history, and its lessons echo into our present day. Nations that build their prosperity on resource extraction without investing in diversification, education, innovation, and productivity are building on sand. When the commodity price turns, as it always eventually does, the foundation crumbles. The story of the Soviet collapse is not just history, it is a warning. Thank you for watching. If you want to understand how economies rise and fall, how wealth is created and destroyed, and what history's greatest cautionary tales teach us about our own time, make sure to subscribe. These patterns repeat, and understanding them might be the most valuable knowledge you can possess. We'll see you in the next one.